Item 666. Retroreflectorized pavement markings. 1. Description. Furnish and place retroreflectorized, non-retroreflectorized, shadow, and profile pavement markings. 2. Materials. 2.1 Type 1 marking materials. Furnish in accordance with DMS 8220, hot applied thermoplastic. Furnish pavement marking material used for Type 1 profile markings and shadow markings that have been approved by the Construction Division, and in accordance with DMS 8220, hot applied thermoplastic. 2.2 Type 1I marking materials. Furnish in accordance with DMS 8200, traffic paint. 2.3 Glass traffic beads. Furnish drop-on glass beads in accordance with DMS 8290, glass traffic beads or as approved. Furnish a double drop of Type 1I and Type 12 drop-on glass beads where each type bead is applied separately in equal portions, by weight, unless otherwise approved. Apply the Type 12 beads before applying the Type 1I beads. 2.4 Labeling. Use clearly marked containers that indicate color, mass, material type, manufacturer, and batch number. 3. Equipment. 3.1 General requirements. Use equipment that is maintained in satisfactory condition, meets or exceeds the requirements of the National Board of Fire Underwriters and the Texas Railroad Commission for this application. Applies beads by an automatic bead dispenser attached to the pavement marking equipment in such a manner that the beads are dispensed uniformly and almost instantly upon the marking as the marking is being applied to the road surface. The bead dispenser must have an automatic cut-off control, synchronized with the cut-off of the pavement marking equipment. Has an automatic cut-off device with manual operating capabilities to provide clean, square marking ends. Is capable of producing the types and shapes of profiles specified, and can provide continuous mixing and agitation of the pavement marking material. The use of pans, aprons, or similar appliances which the dye overruns will not be permitted for longitudinal striping applications. Provide a handheld thermometer capable of measuring the temperature of the marking material when applying Type 1 material. When pavement markings are required to meet minimum retroreflectivity requirements on the plans. Use a mobile retroreflectometer approved by the Construction Division and certified by the Texas A&M Transportation Institute Mobile Retroreflectometer Certification Program. Use a portable retroreflectometer that uses 30-meter geometry and meets the requirements described in ASTM E1710. Has either an internal global positioning system, GPS, or the ability to be linked with an external GPS with a minimum accuracy rating of 16 feet 5 inches, in accordance with the Circular Error Probability, CEP, method. CEP is the radius of the circle with its origin at a known position that encompasses 50% of the readings returned from the GPS instrument. Can record and print the GPS location and retroreflectivity reading for each location where readings are taken. 3.2 Material placement requirements. Use equipment that can place at least 40,000 feet of 4 inches solid or broken non-profile markings per working day at the specified thickness. At least 15,000 feet of solid or broken profile pavement markings per working day at the specified thickness. Linear non-profile markings up to 8 inches wide in a single pass. Non-profile pavement markings other than solid or broken lines at an approved production rate. A center line and no passing barrier line configuration consisting of 1 broken line and 2 solid lines at the same time to the alignment, spacing, and thickness for non-profile pavement markings shown on the plans. Solid and broken lines simultaneously. White line from both sides. Lines with clean edges, uniform cross-section with a tolerance of plus or minus 1/8 inches per 4 inches width, uniform thickness, and reasonably square ends. Skip lines between 10 and 10.5 feet, a stripe to gap ratio of 10 to 30, and a stripe gap cycle between 39.5 feet and 40.5 feet, automatically. Beads uniformly and almost instantly on the marking as the marking is being applied. Beads uniformly during the application of all lines. Each line must have an equivalent bead yield rate and embedment, and double drop bead applications using both type 1I and type 1-2 beads from separate independent bead applicators, unless otherwise approved by the engineer. For construction, place markings before opening to traffic unless short-term or work zone markings are allowed. 4.1 General. Obtain approval for the sequence of work and estimated daily production. Minimize interference to roadway operations when placing markings on roadways open to traffic. Use traffic control as shown on the plans or as approved. Protect all markings placed under open traffic conditions from traffic damage and disfigurement. Establish guides to mark the lateral location of pavement markings as shown on the plans or as directed, and have guide locations verified. Use material for guides that will not leave a permanent mark on the roadway. Apply markings on pavement that is completely dry and passes the following tests. Type 1 marking application. Place a sample of Type 1 marking material on a piece of tar paper placed on the pavement. Allow the material to cool to ambient temperature, and then inspect the underside of the tar paper in contact with the pavement. Pavement will be considered dry if there is no condensation on the tar paper. Type 1I marking application. Place a 1 square feet piece of clear plastic on the pavement, and weight down the edges. The pavement is considered dry if, when inspected after 15 minutes, no condensation has occurred on the underside of the plastic. Apply markings that meet the requirements of TxDOT 828B. That meet minimum retroreflectivity requirements when specified on the plans, applies to Type 1 markings only. Using widths and colors shown on the plans. At locations shown on the plans. In proper alignment with the guides without deviating from the alignment more than 1 inches per 200 feet of roadway or more than 2 inches maximum. Without abrupt deviations. Free of blisters and with no more than 5% by area of holes or voids. With uniform cross-section, density, and thickness. With clean and reasonably square ends. That are retroreflectorized with drop-on glass beads, and using personnel skilled and experienced with installation of pavement markings. Remove all applied markings that are not in alignment or sequence as stated on the plans, or in the specifications, at the contractor's expense in accordance with item 677, eliminating existing pavement markings and markers, except for measurement and payment. 4.2 Surface preparation. Prepare surfaces in accordance with this section unless otherwise shown on the plans. 4.2.1 Cleaning for new asphalt surfaces and retracing of all surfaces. Air blast or broom the pavement surface for new asphalt surfaces, less than 3 years old, and for retracing of all surfaces to remove loose material, unless otherwise shown on the plans. A sealer for Type 1 markings is not required unless otherwise shown on the plans. 4.2.2 Cleaning for old asphalt and concrete surfaces, excludes retracing. Clean old asphalt surfaces, more than 3 years old, and all concrete surfaces in accordance with item 678, pavement surface preparation for markings, to remove curing membrane, dirt, grease, loose and flaking existing construction markings, and other forms of contamination. 4.2.3 Sealer for Type 1 markings. Apply a pavement sealer to old asphalt surfaces, more than 3 years old, and to all concrete surfaces before placing Type 1 markings on locations that do not have existing markings, unless otherwise approved. The pavement sealer may be either a Type 1I marking or an acrylic or epoxy sealer as recommended by the Type 1 marking manufacturer unless otherwise shown on the plans. Follow the manufacturer's directions for application of acrylic or epoxy sealers. Clean sealer that becomes dirty after placement by washing or in accordance with section 666.4.2.1, cleaning for new asphalt surfaces and retracing of all surfaces, as directed. Place the sealer in the same configuration and color, unless clear, as the Type 1 markings unless otherwise shown on the plans. 4.3 Application. Apply markings during good weather unless otherwise directed. If markings are placed at contractor option when inclement weather is impending and the markings are damaged by subsequent precipitation, the contractor is responsible for all required replacement costs. 4.3.1 Type 1 Markings. Place the Type 1 marking after the sealer cures. Apply within the temperature limits recommended by the material manufacturer. Flush the spray head if spray application operations cease for 5 minutes or longer by spraying marking material into a pen or similar container until the material being applied is at the recommended temperature. Apply on clean, dry pavements passing the moisture test described in section 666.4.1, general, and with a surface temperature above 50 degrees Fahrenheit when measured in accordance with TxDOT 829b. 4.3.1.1 Non-profile pavement markings. Apply Type 1 non-profile markings with a minimum thickness of 0.100 inches, 100 mils, for new markings and retracing water-based markings on surface treatments involving item 316, seal code. 0.060 inches, 60 mils, for retracing on thermoplastic pavement markings, or 0.090 inches, 90 mils, for all other Type 1 markings. The maximum thickness for Type 1 non-profile markings is 0.180 inches, 180 mils. Measure thickness for markings in accordance with TxDOT 854b using the tape method. 4.3.1.2 Profile pavement markings. Apply Type 1 profile markings with a minimum thickness of 0.060 inches, 60 mil, for edge line markings, or 0.090 inches, 90 mil, for gore and center line / no passing barrier line markings. In addition, at a longitudinal spacing indicated on the plans, the markings must be profiled in a vertical manner such that the profile is transverse to the longitudinal marking direction. The profile must not be less than 0.30 inches, 300 mil, nor greater than 0.50 inches, 500 mil, in height when measured above the normal top surface plane of the roadway. The transverse width of the profile must not be less than 3.25 inches, and the longitudinal width not less than 1 inches, when measured at the top surface plane of the profile bar. The profile may be either a 1 or 2 transverse bar profile. When the 2 transverse bar profile is used, the spacing between the bases of the profile bars must not exceed 0.50 inches. The above transverse bar width is for each 4 inches of line width. 4.3.2 Type 1I markings. Apply on surfaces with a minimum surface temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Apply at least 20 gallons per mile on concrete and asphalt surfaces and at least 22 gallons per mile on surface treatments for a solid 4 inches line. Adjust application rates proportionally for other widths. When Type 1I markings are used as a sealer for Type 1 markings, apply at least 15 gallons per mile using Type 1I drop-on beads. 4.3.3 Bead coverage. Provide a uniform distribution of beads across the surface of the stripe for Type 1 and Type 1I markings, with 40% to 60% bead embedment. 4.4 Retroreflectivity requirements. When specified on the plans, Type 1 markings must meet the following minimum retroreflectivity values for edge line markings, center line or no passing barrier line, and lane lines when measured any time after 3 days, but not later than 10 days after application. White markings, 250 millicandelas per square meter per lux, MCD/M2/LX. Yellow markings, 175 MCD/M2/LX. 4.5 Retroreflectivity measurements. Use a mobile retroreflectometer for projects requiring minimum retroreflectivity requirements to measure retroreflectivity for contracts totaling more than 200,000 feet of pavement markings, unless otherwise shown on the plans. For contracts with less than 200,000 feet of pavement markings or contracts with call-out work, mobile or portable retroreflectometers may be used at the contractor's discretion. 4.5.1 Mobile retroreflectometer measurements. Provide mobile measurements averages for every 0.1 miles unless otherwise specified or approved. Take measurements on each section of roadway for each series of markings, i.e., edge line, center skip line, each line of a double line, etc., and for each direction of traffic flow. Measure each line in both directions for center lines on two-way roadways, i.e., measure both double solid lines in both directions and measure all center skip lines in both directions. Furnish measurements in compliance with special specification, mobile retroreflectivity data collection for pavement markings, unless otherwise approved. The engineer may require an occasional field comparison check with a portable retroreflectometer meeting the requirements listed above to ensure accuracy. Use all equipment in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations and directions. Inform the engineer at least 24 hours before taking any measurements. A marking meets the retroreflectivity requirements if the combined average retroreflectivity measurement for a 1-mile segment meets the minimum retroreflectivity values specified, and no more than 30% of the retroreflectivity measurement values are below the minimum retroreflectivity requirements value within the 1-mile segment. The engineer may accept failing 1-mile segments if no more than 20% of the retroreflectivity measurements within that mile segment are below the minimum retroreflectivity requirement value. The 1-mile segment will start from the beginning of the data collection and end after a mile worth of measurements have been taken. Each subsequent mile of measurements will be a new segment. Center lines with 2 stripes, either solid or broken, will result in 2 miles of data for each mile segment. Each center line stripe must be tested for compliance as a standalone stripe. Rest ripe at the contractor's expense with a minimum of 0.060 inches, 60 mils, of type 1 marking if the marking fails retroreflectivity requirements. Take measurements every 0.1 miles a minimum of 10 days after the second application within that mile segment for that series of markings. If the markings do not meet minimum retroreflectivity after 10 days of this second application, the engineer may require removal of all existing markings, a new application as initially specified, and a repeat of the application process until minimum retroreflectivity requirements are met. 4.5.2 Portable Retroreflectometer Measurements. Take a minimum of 20 measurements for each 1 mile section of roadway for each series of markings, i.e., edge line, center skip line, each line of a double line, etc., and direction of traffic flow when using a portable reflectometer. Measure each line in both directions for center lines on two-way roadways, i.e., measure both double solid lines in both directions and measure all center skip lines in both directions. The spacing between each measurement must be at least 100 feet. The engineer may decrease the mileage frequency for measurements if the previous measurements provide satisfactory results. The engineer may require the original number of measurements if concerns arise. Rest ripe once at the contractor's expense with a minimum of 0.060 inches, 60 mils, of type 1 marking material if the average of these measurements fails. Take a minimum of 10 more measurements after 10 days of this second application within that mile segment for that series of markings. Rest ripe again at the contractor's expense with a minimum of 0.060 inches, 60 mils, of type 1 marking material if the average of these measurements fall below the minimum retroreflectivity requirements. If the markings do not meet minimum retroreflectivity after this third application, the engineer may require removal of all existing markings, a new application as initially specified, and a repeat of the application process until minimum retroreflectivity requirements are met. 4.5.3 Traffic Control. Provide traffic control, as required, when taking retroreflectivity measurements after marking application. On low-volume roadways, as defined on the plans, refer to the figure, Temporary Road Closure in Part 6 of the Texas Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices for the minimum traffic control requirements. For all other roadways, the minimum traffic control requirements will be as shown on the Traffic Control Plan, TCP, Standard Sheets TCP, 3:1, and TCP, 3:2. The lead vehicle will not be required on divided highways. The TCP and traffic control devices must meet the requirements listed in item 502, barricades, signs, and traffic handling. Time restrictions that apply during striping application will also apply during the retroreflectivity inspections except when using the mobile retroreflectometer unless otherwise shown on the plans or approved. 4.6 Performance period. All markings must meet the requirements of this specification for at least 30 calendar days after installation. Unless otherwise directed, remove pavement markings that fail to meet requirements, and replace at the contractor's expense. Replace failing markings within 30 days of notification. All replacement markings must also meet all requirements of this item for a minimum of 30 calendar days after installation. 5. Measurement. This item will be measured by the foot, by each word, symbol, or shape, or by any other unit shown on the plans. Each stripe will be measured separately. This is a plan's quantity measurement item. The quantity to be paid is the quantity shown in the proposal unless modified by Article 9.2, Plans Quantity Measurement. Additional measurements or calculations will be made if adjustments of quantities are required. Acrylic or epoxy sealer, or Type 1I markings when used as a sealer for Type 1 markings, will be measured by the foot, by each word, symbol, or shape, or by any other unit shown on the plans. 6. Payment. The work performed and materials furnished in accordance with this item and measured as provided under measurement will be paid for at the unit price bid for pavement sealer of the size specified, retroreflectorized pavement markings of the type and color specified and the shape, width, size, and thickness specified as applicable, retroreflectorized pavement markings with retroreflective requirements of the types, colors, sizes, widths, and thicknesses specified or retroreflectorized. Profile pavement markings of the various types, colors, shapes, sizes, and widths specified. This price is full compensation for application of pavement markings, materials, equipment, labor, tools, and incidentals. Surface preparation of new concrete and asphalt concrete pavements more than 3 years old, where no stripe exists, will be paid for under item 678. Pavement surface preparation for markings. Surface preparation of all other asphalt and old concrete pavement, except for sealing, will not be paid for directly but is subsidiary to this item. Work zone pavement markings, Type 1I, paint and beads, used as a sealer for Type 1 markings, thermoplastic, will be paid for under item 662, work zone pavement markings. If the engineer requires that markings be placed in inclement weather, repair or replacement of markings damaged by the inclement weather will be paid for in addition to the original plan's quantity.